Good afternoon. So today we're going to talk about the legislative process and how something goes from an idea and actually becomes a law. We're going to look at statutes, the legislative process, and the paper trail. This is really important as a researcher. As you are aware of each step of the process, it's always good to ask yourself the question, what kind of physical documents does it produce? Because often in interpreting statutes, courts will look at legislative intent, and that information is usually gleaned from reviewing the very materials we'll talk about today. So let's go. Legislation. So today we're focused on federal legislation. You will find that the system in place for most state legislative bodies is very similar. I think it's hard to kind of understand the United States without understanding the tension that has always existed between the powers of the states and the powers of the federal government. When the US was first formed as a country, there was a lot of suspicion around too much power being held by the federal government. States were very independent and were very reluctant to cede their power. So when they put the Constitution together, they gave Congress enumerated powers, which simply means very specific listed powers. They weren't granting a general police power to Congress, but only specific enumerated powers. So let's look at what those are. Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution details what kind of powers the U.S. Congress has. So the biggest power, the one that most legislation comes from, is the Commerce Clause. And in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, you'll see that Congress has the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. So this is one that has actually been the source of most federal legislation. You will see cases that challenge particular statutes saying that Congress exceeded the scope of its authority in enacting a particular statute. Typically, that's an argument that says what Congress has done does not touch on commerce, and so therefore is outside the scope of Congress's authority. There are other two key powers that I think we want to focus on, is the power to tax and spend for common defense and general welfare. This is Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. You know, this is really when we talked about FDR earlier and Obamacare's healthcare mandate. These bills and these pieces of legislation were actually justified through the taxing power. And the way this works is that Congress has the power to tax and can also condition the receipt of federal money by the individual states upon compliance with federal legislative administrative directives. So this has been the basis of power to expand the role and reach of the federal government. Finally, the other big power is the necessary and proper clause. Once again, this is in Article 1, Section 8, and it basically says that Congress has the power to make all laws which will be necessary and proper for carrying into execution all of its other powers. And so this is one that's kind of a catch-all. It's a nice power to extend congressional reach into a lot of fields. On the other hand, there's the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And this one says that the power is not delegated to the U.S., the federal government, nor prohibited by the states, are reserved to the states and the people. So again, here's this tension between federal power and state power. So this amendment was basically saying, unless it's part of your listed power, you can't do it. This belongs to the state. And so typically states are bodies that have general powers, like a general police power. So they have the ability to pass laws regarding public health, safety, morals, crimes, and really, you know, a vast array of things. They're not enumerated powers, they're general powers at the state level. And the only limits on the state statutory power, it relates to limitations imposed by the U.S. Constitution, the state constitution, and notions of preemption. Preemption is the idea that there are specific areas that are reserved to the federal government, or that the federal government so controls that states do not have a place to act. But just keep in mind that when you read cases, you will see this tension play out over and over again in terms of who has the power to do what. then it's really a tension between a strong federal authority or individual states having more power. So this is a famous quote, laws are like sausages, it's better not to see them being made. And while certainly the legislative process is one that can be confusing, complex, and at times difficult to understand, it is also at the backbone of democracy. Without a democratically elected institution, then laws are made by fiat. And so while the process is messy, so is much of human interaction. And I think it's good to understand how it works so that you have a chance to be able to readily argue what a piece of legislation means and be able to reference back to legislative materials to bolster your argument. So let's talk a little bit about the legislative process. You know, I've spent a fair amount of time working in the legislature, both in law school and in my role as an executive director for a nonprofit focused on criminal justice reform. And so at first, I'd just like to simplify the process for you. Initially, there is an introduction of a bill. The bill is just the statutory language that was drafted by the sponsor or sometimes even a public interest group to suggest a change or a new law. All those bills have to go before a committee, and committees are typically assigned by jurisdiction type. So you may have a House committee on the judiciary that deals with bills that impact the court system. Similarly, you could have a Senate bill or a Senate committee on the judiciary that will also look at those matters. Those committee hearings are scheduled, they're calendared, they're often public, people make comment. If the bill makes it through a committee, and typically a committee has to vote to allow the bill to proceed, it will go to the House floor or the Senate floor, where once again there is debate and there is a vote to see if it goes further. To the extent that it actually makes it past both chambers of the legislature, both the House approve it and the Senate approve it, then it has become a bicameral resolution, which is essentially when two legislative chambers agree to the same thing. It goes on to the president for signature. So this is kind of an oversimplification, but if you can keep this rough idea in your head, it'll help you understand what are the key pieces in the process that are important for your research. I'm going to upload this visual to Canvas as well. This is a much more detailed piece of the process, and this is actually provided on congress.gov. It goes through the legislative process in more detail. You can see how the bill is introduced. There's committee work, calendaring, debate, budget, and engrossment. And then it has to go through the Senate side for the same thing. Committee, debate, enrollment, and then final approval or disapproval and publication. But to the extent you're doing more extensive legislative research, it's helpful to know the details of this process. But let's just start with the beginning. So again, we're focusing on the federal process, and most of the rules governing how the legislative process proceeds really come from the internal rules of each chamber. The Constitution has a few requirements, but they're pretty broad. Also, most states mirror this. Nebraska is slightly different. It only has one legislative chamber, but the rest of the states have a House and a Senate. So here are the constitutional limitations. Every bill which shall have passed the House of the Representatives and the Senate shall, before becoming a law, be presented to the President of the United States for signature. So this is in Article 1, Section 7, and this is the most well-defined rule of process in the Constitution, except for this one. It does say in the Constitution that all revenue-raising bills have to originate in the House. So think of tax bills. All of those have to begin in the House. So typically the House has a major role dealing with the budget. But outside that, each House can determine the rules of their proceedings. Article 1, Section 5. So I've listed here the websites where you can go into the depth of how the House governs its procedures and how the Senate defines its own procedures. And these are really determined by their own chambers. So they can be very complex, but if you have to do a deep dive, those are the resources to kind of give you a sense of what those look like. So again, we're really concerned with the paper trail. As a researcher, I'm always thinking about what kind of paper does this process produce? Because I want to be able to find it, read it, and cite it when I'm going before a court and explaining what I think a statute means. As we walk through the process today, I'm going to point out the documents that each step generates. Later on, we'll go into more depth about finding some of these sources. One thing I want to point out too is I'm trying to include sample citation formats as we go through each item, just so you have a reference point that's contextualized in the work. Again, one of my favorite public websites is congress.gov. It will have the text of bills, public laws, items on the congressional record, votes, committee reports, and summaries of congressional activity. There are other database sources that are paid for. They're also excellent, but I always like to point out the free ones in case you don't have access to the paid services. So one of the items I posted in our modules is this short video. And while it's something that's kind of humorous, this was really the introduction most Americans had to the legislative process. This is a video that was shown to most elementary and grade school children throughout the last few decades. And what I think is nice about it is it just gives, again, a very simplified view of the process so you understand some of the basics. So essentially, a bill is really the legislative embodiment of an idea. The bills contain the proposed text of the law as introduced by its sponsors. And it can begin in either chamber, unless it's for appropriations. In my legislative work, I remember working with different representatives where we would come to them and suggest specific language for the bill. If the representative was interested in the idea that we were working on, they would actually ask us to draft the language of the bill. We would, and then typically that would go through their own legislative chambers and be revisited and revised. But learning how to do legislative drafting is a great way to come to the ability to change things and create better outcomes for the ideas you represent. So where do bills come from? The legislator or the sponsor begins the bill and proposes it. That's a representative or a senator, both. It can come from a committee, legislative staff, the executive branch, state government, constituents. So that's where I drafted bills. I drafted bills dealing with mental health issues. I drafted bills dealing with criminal justice reform. But anyone can really be the source of an idea. It's simply a sponsor has to be the one who's willing to introduce the bill into the chamber. NGOs, nonprofit organizations, and really it's just anyone. You can call your representative and say, I think we should have a bill about X. To the extent your representative agrees with your idea and you have the political support, they're likely to move forward. So just keep in mind that the origin can be almost anywhere, but the sponsor has to come from within the chamber. Another research tip, the Congressional Research Service does a wonderful job in providing legislative history for major bills. And so they put together the entire analysis you might want to see. It's not for every bill, but it's a really great starting place if you're working on a major policy issue. If you go to their reports, they will kind of walk you through exactly why the bill was put together, the purpose it was meant to serve, and describe its journey through the legislative chamber. So what happens now? It's been introduced. So the bill is read into the record and assigned a number. It's also assigned to a committee. And again, typically the committee that it's assigned to is one that deals with the subject matter related to the bill. But this is also a political process. When you are working to get a bill through the legislative process, you want to know who heads the committee that your bill is getting sent to. Because often a bill could be sent to 2 or 3 committees or subcommittees that have jurisdiction over the subject matter, but maybe the head of one of those committees is much more friendly to you. So there's a lot of politicking going on in finding out where your bill is sent to and creating relationships with the heads of those committees so that your bill can get a hearing. Okay, so paper trail number 1, the bill text. So the legislative history is the paper trail generated by the bill. And there are some key milestones in this process. One is the introduced bill. So you want to see what the bill looked like. What was the language as it was introduced by its sponsor? If there are amendments, you want to see what those were and who promoted them and why. And then you want to look at the engrossed bill. So this is the version of the bill that has passed one chamber but may have differences between it and a companion bill from the other chamber. So you may have two bills dealing with the same subject matter in parallel proceeding through the House and the Senate, or you could have a bill that is engrossed from the House and then gets introduced in the Senate chamber. But often, each legislative body will add amendments and create little tweaks to the bill. So you want to see if the bills are actually the same. So once you get to that point, you have what's known as an enrolled bill. And so that's when the version of the bill has passed both chambers in identical language. Only then can it be presented to the president. So what do these look like? You'll see a lot of references to this. So if you see H.R., that's a bill from the House. S. is a Senate bill. There are other versions such as resolutions, H.R. Res or S. Res. Those are less common in your research because those typically deal with minor matters or maybe are only important to a small number of people. Bill numbers are assigned in order of submission, and they reset at the end of Congress after the election. So, just to get a handle on what that means, you can see, for example, a citation to a bill would be the Privacy Protection Act of 1998. So that's the title of the bill, right? And then its bill number is HR 3224. So this means it was the 3,224th bill introduced in the 105th Congress in 1998. And this also gives the section number that's relevant to what you're talking about, along with the citation. So just remember, a lot of bills come out in Congress, not a lot of bills get passed, but that's why you'll see these bill numbers in this format. I always like to break down citations because I feel like that's a good way to learn, and I always like to learn them as I am doing that particular topic. So again, just as a reminder, let's take this Senate bill. This is a Blue Book Rule 13. Again, we're looking at the blue pages because we're not writing law review articles. And so the S is for Senate, 516 is the bill number. So that's the 516th bill in the Senate in the 105th Congress. And again, the congressional sessions are chronological. So the first session of Congress was in 1789. The 116th session of Congress proceeds from January 3rd, 2020 to January 2021. So you're going to always have a number that tells you which Congress it is. The closer the number is to 116, you know it's more recent. The preferred way to abbreviate the term Congress is just CONG period. You'll see this funny section symbol. It looks like two S's that are kissing. That is the universal symbol for section. And so the 2 tells us, okay, this is section 2 of this particular bill that is relevant to you and the year of publication. And the House side is very similar. Instead of having S, we have HR that tells us this bill came from the House of Representatives. We have the bill number, which Congress. This bill came from the 95th Congress, so it was much earlier in 1977. The same abbreviation, and again, the year of publication. So just keep in mind, this is what a good citation looks like if you're dealing with a legislative bill. Now let's talk about committee work. Much of Congress's actual work takes place in the committees, and they look like this. There are a bunch of representatives or senators sitting behind a podium, and people are testifying in front of them to explain why they support a bill or why they don't. Notes are taken, people testify, and this is all recorded. So committee hearings are actually an incredible tool for Congress. Congress can issue a subpoena. The testimony is under oath. Often people will provide written statements as well as spoken statements when they are faced with questions. And the testimony is by invitation. So the parties can request to speak, but typically the committee invites you to speak. I had the opportunity to testify at the federal level in front of a civil rights committee, and it was by invitation, and I submitted both a written statement and I was able to speak before the committee. But primarily speaking deals with being able to field the questions from committee members and respond to them kind of on your feet. And that's actually an important skill for attorneys. Being able to testify in a committee gives you the chance to shape legislation and also to make sure that the congressional body is aware of the particular concerns you wish to raise. There is a paper trail, which is always handy. So the hearing transcripts are published. So if you look at govinfo.gov, this particular website, you can find congressional hearings from 1957 forward. Excuse me. So what does a committee do? So they have this hearing, which is basically a fact-finding session with witnesses and reports, and they listen. They may mark up the bill then after they've heard the testimony, changing some of the language. Something they've listened to at the hearing has made them understand that they need to do something differently. Then they issue a report, which is a text of the marked up bill with a section-by-section explanation of findings and recommendations on action. And then there is a table. A committee may table a bill, which means they do nothing. So this is the way bills die. So committees are kind of like stoplights. If you don't get through a committee, your bill will go nowhere. And the committee has the discretion to not let your bill even come up for a vote, or even to move forward with the bill at all. It doesn't even have to have a hearing. So if the committee tables a bill, one that you care about, that may be its death knell. So committees have tremendous power. So I always think it's good to share the citation form of a committee hearing. So this is just a sample. So in this case, you can italicize or underline. Protection from Personal Intrusion Act and Privacy Protection Act of 1998, hearing on H.R. 2448 and H.R. 3224, those are the bills, before the House Committee on the Judiciary. And you can see how the abbreviations work. H is for House, COMM for Committee, and it's the 105th Congress. And it also gives you the specific page number in the citation, the year, and you can have a parenthetical that describes who's making the statement. Is this, the president of the Screen Actors Guild, or who is this person? So you can see that there is a specific format, and this is in Blue Rule 13.3. So just make sure you know if you are citing committee hearings, there are specific formats in mind. Okay, paper trail number 3. Committee reports. So this is at the end of the process. They've heard the testimony, the hearing's taken place, and the committee has decided to issue a report. So there's a lengthy document, and it details the facts, purpose, and the content of the bill, and it's really useful as a source of legislative intent, because this is actually kind of the spoken word of the committee in terms of what they are trying to accomplish with a particular bill. It's published electronically, and it's part of the congressional serials set. ProQuest Congressional has abstracts and full text of the congressional hearings from 1824 to the present. And ProQuest Legislative Insight has prepared legislative histories as well for particular bills. It is, a lengthy process to find your legislative history sometime. So it's wonderful if you can find one that has been launched for you. It can at least launch you in your process more quickly. And again, congress.gov has congressional reports and is a free version. But this is one you're going to really want to use if you care about talking about what the intent was behind the legislative matter. Let's look at one, just on congress.gov. So you can see it allows you to search on the left-hand side by committee reports. And I just did a filter of, let me just see the committee reports in the 104th to the 116th Congresses. And you can make it more narrow, but you can see right away that they have the House reports, and it just goes into detail there. So you can see congress.gov gives you full access to these materials if you don't have access to some of the paid databases. In terms of citations for hearing reports and federal documents, House report documents are referred to in this way. You can see the report here on congress.gov. So it's HR report, the number of the report, which is highlighted for you, the part of the report, and the page number is referred to at, and here's the year. The Senate reports are the same way. So I always think it's nice to know what it looks like. So here you can see in the picture what the House report looks like from congress.gov. So then it's finally made it to the floor. What happens next? There's floor debate. The body of the chamber, the House or the Senate, has a second reading of the bill and discusses and proposes amendments. The House has a limited debate in terms of time and scope, and the Senate has unlimited debate. However, the rule is that 60 votes are generally required to close a debate. So bills or amendments to bills require a simple majority in either chamber. So it's definitely a process that evolves and involves a lot of procedural maneuvering. So the other thing you want to be aware of is the congressional record. So the floor debate is transcribed into the congressional record, and it's published daily. At the end of the session, the permanent edition is compiled and published. So this just shows you on congress.gov what the congressional record looks like. And it's very helpful if you want to know what the debate was on a recent bill or a matter that you're concerned about. And then the same thing happens again in the Senate. So I just kind of described the process generally in the House, but the Senate does it again. So there can be a companion bill. It's introduced into either chamber, and it goes through the whole process. And each chamber will produce an engrossed bill. And again, this is the one that has been passed and certified by the secretary of that chamber. But the bills have to pass both chambers. When you have two bills that are similar, but not exactly the same, there will be a conference committee. Members of each chamber will meet together, and it will have each of those come together and produce a conference report. And it has a compromise bill. So they kind of give and take and trade, and then they explain it like any other committee report, which is also very helpful if you're trying to figure out what was ultimately decided when the final version of the bill came out. If both chambers pass the new harmonized bill, the bill is enrolled. The enrolled bill is presented to the president, and if he or she signs it, it becomes law. If the president just doesn't do anything for 10 days and Congress is still in session, it becomes law. The president can veto the bill and send it back to Congress again. Congress can override a veto with a 2/3 vote in both chambers. But that's pretty rare. Out of 1,513 vetoes, only 111 have been overridden. So again, this is part of the checks and balances system.